This program is brought to you by Jizzy.
برعاية كوندور.
Condor, prenez votre envol.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to this special coverage of L24 covering the Brics Summit in its 15th edition. So, leaders of the 5 member states of Brics, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, started this Tuesday a 3-day summit in the capital, Johannesburg, South Africa, where they are discussing a possible expansion of the group that harbors ambitions of becoming an alternative to Western-led alliances such as the group of the G7. The new geopolitical situation in the world prevailing now following Russia's military operation in Ukraine and the current tacit trade war between Washington as well as, on the other hand, Beijing have brought to the table a discussion of strengthening the bloc. And to this end, multiple questions come to the scene. What are the main goals of this summit at this particular stage? And is the expansion that is occurring right now, what role that the new members could bring to the table? Multiple questions will have to be answered with our panel of guests, Mr. Dennis Spiel, founding member of Schiller Institute from New Jersey, USA, and from China, journalist of the CGTN national television, Mrs. Chang Chanhui. Hello and welcome to our dear viewers, and we are also joined with our L24 special envoy from Johannesburg, Mr. Islam Said. A special break, and we came back to our subject. So now, before we delve into our discussion, we are joined live with our special envoy to L24, Mr. Islam Said. So, Islam, hello there. So, Islam, put us on the table. What can you say over the first proceedings day of the summit in Johannesburg?
Okay. So, hello, Abdurrahim. Hello, dear viewers. We are here in Johannesburg in South Africa, where the summit of the Brics in its 15th edition is taking place. And the first day of the summit was topped by calls of increasing investments and projects in various fields in Africa, including the exploiting the African continental free trade area, as well as mobilizing massive projects, infrastructure, and massive or sustainable development in among the 5 emerging economies of the Brics. And during the meeting also, there was a lot of talking about the promoting the Brics nations, promoting the Brics nations and the bloc's contribution to the world growth. And there are some indicators concerning the expansion of the bloc. There are some indicators that show that the bloc is expected to be expanded. However, there wasn't a consensus, and the leaders of the bloc are not decisive about this matter. And we know that so many countries from Africa, from Asia, and from South America showed interest to join this economic coalition, which surpasses the G7 GDP growth global contribution. And also, concerning the the Brics currency, there were no talks about the creating Brics currency. However, the de-dollarization momentum has been building with Russia, China, and Brazil using non-dollar currencies at cross-border transactions. And there are also a consensus, or there is a consensus about strengthening local currencies to use it in exchanges among the five emerging countries of the BRICS.
Mr. Islam Seed, thank you ever so much for this explanation. I believe it's time late over there, so thank you so much again. So now, before coming to you, our dear guest and panel of guests, let's tackle this report and we start our discussion.
BRICS and Africa, that is the main theme of the BRICS summit, which kicked off in the Sandton Convention Center in the South African city of Johannesburg. Several delegations from Africa, Asia and Latin America are attending the 15th edition of the Economic Coalition meeting. Climate change, sustainable and business development in Africa were among the topics discussed by economic officials from the BRICS 5 member countries during the bloc's Business Council Forum, held concurrently with the 15th edition of the BRICS Summit.
The BRICS countries have an opportunity to contribute to and participate in Africa's growth story. This can be achieved through greater cooperation in areas such as infrastructure, agriculture, manufacturing, new energy, and the digital economy.
As the summit goes on, leaders of the BRICS nations expressed optimism over the group's progress and contribution to global economy, as the latter surpassed the GDP of the Group of Seven.
Thank you very much.
The figures speak for themselves. Over the past decade, mutual investments of the BRICS member states have increased sixfold. In turn, their investments in the global economy as a whole have doubled, and their combined exports have reached 20% of the world total.
Indicators seem to be positive, as the leaders of the BRICS member countries defended the economic achievements of the 5 emerging economies, paving the way for cooperation within the bloc and with the whole world. Chinese President Xi Jinping was represented by his Minister of Commerce, while Russian President Vladimir Putin delivered a pre-recorded speech to the summit. The Chinese official underlined the role that BRICS plays in setting a new commercial and environmental world order.
The BRICS has made a name for itself as a force working for fairer, more predictable and more equitable global trade. We cannot accept a green neocolonialism that imposes trade barriers and discriminatory measures under the pretext of protecting the environment.
The BRICS, which counts for more than 40% of the world's population, is now looking to boost its global economic presence through diversifying its fields of activity and advocating for more cooperation and growth in and outside the bloc.
To this point, I'll be starting with you, Mr. Dennis. In your opinion, what should be the priorities of the current summit? Is expanding the group indicative of steps toward multipolarity?
Well, I think expanding the group is definitely that, but I just want to say this is a very proud moment. You have to consider that if you look at the trade between China and Africa, just alone, that during the year 2022, it hit $282 billion. If you take the 4 BRICS nations, Russia, India, Brazil, and China, their trade with the BRICS is something like $425 billion. If you look at it in terms of as a block, that's already going on. But see, Dilma Rousseff, who is there with President Lula, former president of Brazil herself, and who is the head of the new development bank of the BRICS, has made a very important point. She says that the BRICS Bank, just to quote her, she said, we expect to lend between $8 to $10 billion this year, but they want to make 30% of that happen in local currencies. Now, what she has also said is, this is not an alternative to the dollar. This is an alternative to a system. And she went on to talk about the idea that we are going to transform ourselves into an important bank for developing nations and emerging markets. Our focus has to be that, a bank made by developing countries for developing countries. This is revolutionary. It's not against United States or against Europe. It is for the nations that used to be called the third world, but now are clearly the center of the engine of the world economy. And Africa is being brought into that and is stepping into that right in lockstep with the people of the nations of the Brics.
Quickly understood. Saying your words, this is kind of revolutionary, Mr. Dennis. It goes in which way? I mean, some of them, they think that these BRICS and these countries, 5 countries, they are kind of, as you may say, probably against the West and the alliance and the IMF. Do you think that they will consider the new members as enemies?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that question because, I'm from the Schiller Institute, and the head of our organization just issued a statement. This is Helga Seppel-LaRouche, and she said she's appealing to the citizens of what she calls the global north to support this construction. Now, she says in her statement, despite the fact that there were Western attempts to disrupt it, that this meeting in Johannesburg will demonstrate to the whole world that a new world economic order is emerging, opening a new chapter in human history, the end of colonialism. Now, let's put it like this. The United States, for example, according to what was said back in 1955, the first successful anti-colonial revolution in history, the founders of the Bandung Conference always saw the United States as a potential ally. But the United States no longer seems to recognize itself. And so when you see a development like this, instead of recognizing your own roots, if you see it as an enemy, as an adversary, I think it means that you've got to reflect on your relationship, including to the idea of the end of colonialism. That's all that these nations are trying to do from anything I can see. I want to say very specifically, I particularly applaud the role of China and Russia in doing that. I know that may sound controversial, but I think that the last 15 years or so of what has happened in Africa has demonstrated that it is absolutely possible to have a kind of collaborative arrangement among nations. You don't have to take from nations. You can have a win-win cooperation.
Very good indeed. Thank you so much for highlighting this point. Coming to you, Ms. Jiang, with calls to abandon the dollar and numerous requests to join the BRICS, the current context strengthening the proposal for a new currency, as recently stated by a Brazilian president in Paris, saying that why should we use the dollar in trade with Argentina or China when it is possible to do this with our currencies? What are you saying about this?
Yeah, exactly. We can still remember that during his visit to China in late April of this year, Brazilian President Lula asked, why do so many countries use the US dollar for settlements? Why can't we use our own country's currency for settlement? And why can't we use the renminbi or Brazilian currency for settlement? And what is interesting is that we have already seen that these kind of currency exchanges coming, the local currencies are using now between the bilateral commerce between China and Brazil. So is it possible that these currencies of members countries of the new development bank playing a new role today in the world stage? And some emerging countries have gradually begun to consider the diversification of their foreign exchanges reserves in order to deal with the financial risk which is a single foreign exchange reserve can create. So it is very important for financial independence of one country, especially for one developing country. And by reducing the use of the US dollar, a nation or a country can reduce its independence on the US financial system and strengthen its own financial independence and sustainability. And why is it? Because after the failure of the Bretton Woods system, if the dollar has always remained very powerful, it is because that the powerful factor of the petrodollar. But today, the influence of the United States in the Middle East is less important than before, which means that there is today a new order in the Middle East. And also, especially after the major oil-producing countries such as Saudi Arabia and Iraq announced that they have started using renminbi or other currencies for settlement, which has accelerated the de-dollarization process. And also today we have seen that in some cases, the U.S. is imposing a unilateral sanctions on foreign countries. And also there is the American economist called Peter Arrow from American Institute of Economic Research. He pointed in his article, The Dollarization Has Begun, that the US dollar have gradually evolved from an ordinary vehicle for payment, settlement, and investment to a currency used by the US government. And so it is interesting to see that there is a shifting, there is a kind of changing now coming up. But I mean, it is today still the case that the US dollar is still the most important sovereign international currencies in the world today. And the US dollar undoubtedly represents the largest proportion in the international price and settlements. But today we are seeing that there is something happening. There is something that begun to show the signs is that if there's another possibilities, if there's an alternative for the developing countries to have their own currencies in exchanges, in commerce, in settlements, in investments. So that will be interesting to see how this trend will be evaluating and how this trend will have its fruits coming out in these coming days.
Perfectly understood. The right from you was saying that there is something happening. I mean, after every actions, there is a reaction. Now, the West are just trying to see what is happening in BRICS, the new memberships, the new countries. Do you think that they will just keep watching, or there are some actions that will be done?
You mean in the dollar or in the currency use?
Of course, in general, how do they will face this BRICS bloc?
Today, it is interesting to see that when we talk about the BRICS bloc, we're talking about not only cooperations between BRICS members, which is to see the 5 countries, which is China, Brazil, and also Russia, and India, and also South Africa. But we can also see that there's also other countries who are coming to join, who are willing to join this mechanism. And also there's one thing that we should not ignore, which is the establishment of a very important institution. The building is in Shanghai, by the way, called the Development Bank, which is actually related to the BRICS. So why do we talk about this institution? And because you were just asking me this question about the currency issue, about the multilateral cooperation in financial issues, multilateral cooperation in currency issues, and also multilateral cooperation in all about banking issues. So today there are 2 different banks in multilateral ways in the world. So the first one is the Multilateral Development Bank in the North-South cooperation, such as the World Bank. And there's another one in the South-South cooperation, such as the New Development Bank, which is part of the BRICS mechanism today. And so we can see that today there is differences between these 2 types of banks. Even these are all multilateral banks, but the way that it works are different. So for example, present for the North-South cooperation banks, we can see that the voting rights or the shareholding or the fund sourcing of these kind of multilateral development banks are often dominated by the developed countries or entities. But on contrary, we can see that for the New Development Bank, which is under the mechanism of BRICS mechanism and BRICS cooperation, it's actually owned by the member countries. So we have just another guest who just brought up this idea that this is made by the developing countries for the developing countries. And we can also actually put the spirit like this, which means that the development bank, the New Development Bank, is actually owned by the member countries of the BRICS, which have equal voting rights and also the control of the shareholders. So in this way, we can say that on one hand, to ensure the resources that the old resources, I mean the financial resources, different kind of currency resources can be mobilized at reasonable cost. And also on the other hand, we can say that the influence of the orientation of the investment is also according to requirement of the 5 BRICS countries, as well as all other developing countries and emerging countries. So in short, we can say that these kind of financial institutions, these kind of banks have given more voice to developing countries and emphasizing in equality and also better respect on its sovereign independence. So in these cases, we can say that there is a difference coming out. And the signs actually are already coming out. So we can check out for the coming 2 days if there are new progress, or if there will be new settlements, new emphasis, or new ideas by this 15th summit.
Perfectly understood. Thank you ever so much for these points, Mrs. Zhang. Coming back to you, Mr. Dennis. Mrs. Zhang has highlighted the idea of the World Bank development that belongs to the BRICS. On the other side of the West, they do have the IMF and the World Bank, and you already before has described as a bankrupt bank that's causing problems in the world. I mean, how the bankrupt IMF will face this new World Bank development in the BRICS?
Well, you see, we have what is happening here is the issue of the fate of humanity is in play, but in a positive way. For example, Africa, that's 1.2 to 1.3 billion people. China is 1.4 billion. India is 1.2 billion. Pretty soon you're going to be talking about real numbers. In other words, that's where humanity is. Humanity is in these locations. So the International Monetary Fund has traditionally done something which I believe is nefarious, and I have always opposed. And Dilma Rousseff referenced it. She talked about something called conditionalities, but she didn't say, and here's what she had to say: we repudiate any kind of conditionality. Often a loan is given upon the condition that certain policies are carried out. We don't do that. We respect the policies of each country. We will transform ourselves into an important bank for developing countries. Now, what is she saying? She's saying, well, instead of that policy where you've got to do what we say because we are giving you the resources, although they're only giving you money, really, you've got the resources. You've got the precious minerals, you got the strategic minerals, and you have the farmland, you have the people, you have the labor. But because of the way that the system, it was referenced before, the Bretton Woods system, which collapsed in 1971, from that time, the International Monetary Fund used the ability from the older system to leverage power. So they were not merely using money or extending money. That was not, they were doing it in an unjust way. And when, for example, in Africa in the 1980s, they tried to follow the IMF rules through the so-called structural adjustment programs. I mean, many of these nations were born after me. Now, I don't want to date myself, but it's true. They were born in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And so by the time that they first got independence, they were immediately put into this vice called the structural adjustment programs of the International Monetary Fund. And so what would happen is that often it was sort of banker's arithmetic. You would borrow, for example, $100 million, but then you would have interest rates, and then you wouldn't be able to pay, and then you would refinance. So you would end up paying back more than you borrowed in the first place. And you could never get out of this circumstance. It's very familiar to people in America from the old sharecropper system after slavery, when black people, when they were liberated from slavery, but they didn't have any capital, obviously. And what would happen is they were placed into a position on the farms where they would have to buy all of their seed and their grain or whatever they needed and their implements, but they would never be able to catch up with how much it would cost. That same sharecropping mentality, that is the way that the International Monetary Fund and World Bank dealt with a lot of these countries. Mm-hmm. And so now that's over. That's declared over. Here's what can happen, because there's a choice. Take, for example, Saudi Arabia. There's a great concern in Washington right now that the Saudis are going to join the BRICS, because if that happens, that could really suddenly the question of the U.S. dollar, as they talk about it, would be very, very different. But I also want to point something out to you. The people of the United States don't benefit from what's happening with the U.S. dollar. Look at American cities. Look at American unemployment. Look at the drug problem in America, 100,000 people dying of overdoses. If you look at the poverty in the United States, clearly the American people are not actually seeing the benefits of this. So the attack, which is an attack on the wrong thing, on injustice, which we all should do, that is not a hostile action against Western nations unless the leadership of Western nations, betraying their own people, refuse to collaborate in a win-win process, in a mutual process in which everyone can gain, no one has to lose. Arrangements can be made to help one another. And that idea of a new time of mutual cooperation, that's called the principle of the general welfare. That's in the U.S. Constitution. So people can be against it, and institutions will talk, and State Department people will yell and scream. But the truth is, this is a blow for humanity as a whole. What we're seeing happening here, even if, it's just one conference and a lot of things have to happen, but it is a positive direction for all of humanity. And hopefully people will see it that way.
Very, very good points you have highlighted always, Mr. Dennis. Unfortunately, Mr. David Monnier, so far, he couldn't manage to be with us. He's from South Africa. He's taking part in this summit. So, coming back to you, Mrs. Zhang, could the new candidates which are looking to join the bloc fulfill the requirements and the conditions that the alliance has set for membership, taking into consideration the huge figures and statistics recently recorded in Economies and the GDP of China, Russia, India, Brazil, and even South Africa, accounting for 42% of the world's GDP?
Yeah, it is very interesting actually to see the attractions and the charm of this BRICS mechanism this time. But I mean, concretely, today we have seen that there are many countries, and there's actually more than 20 countries who wanted to participate in this BRICS mechanism. And we can see that there's already more countries than the original 5 member of BRICS being part of this new development bank that I just mentioned just now. For example, we can talking about different, especially developing countries coming to join us this time. And also, we can also see this time there is a huge influence in Africa of this mechanism with the theme of BRICS in Africa, a partnership for mutually accelerated growth, a sustainable development, and an exclusive multilateralism. And also, very important also with the presence of Chinese president, also of the Brazil, and also from the South African part. So it is very important actually to see that many developing countries are there, are present, are also trying to contribute its own force. But concretely speaking, what are the criteria for new countries joining the mechanism? It is very important. It's very interesting to see. I mean, all the member countries should be agree with the nomination. So that will be one core issue that we need to focus on for these coming days. If there are a possibility for an expansion, and if so, which are the countries who will be admitted, who will be accepted to join the BRICS mechanism. So this is a very interesting issue to see. But there's also another thing that is in the case, is the openness of this organization, which means that the BRICS mechanism is not a small club, but it's more a platform that welcome, whether you are observatory, whether you're a country observer, or whether you're a country participant, or whether simply you're just an organization or a part who is actually interested to know more about this mechanism. Everybody can join. Everybody can join coming, being part of it. So this is the part of the openness. This is the spirit, also I would say, from the developing countries, is that today, developing countries, their voice need to be heard, their presence need to be seen, their force need to be felt today in this world, and also how to bring these different forces together to contribute to a larger possibility of humanity. This is one of the most important issues to be talking about. And we can say that today the BRICS and Africa, there's a lot to come, and the BRICS mechanism have already demonstrated its force coming together. When we talk about the GDP of BRICS mechanism countries, when we talk about the surface of these territories of BRICS mechanism countries, we can see that it is today already a very important economy today in this world. So it is very important for the multi-polarization of the world. It is very important for the development of economy of the world. And so it is important that faced with the developed countries, we need to let the developing countries' voice heard. That's very important.
Perfectly understood. Now, before moving to another point to be discussed, let's tackle this point by Mr. Abdel Noor Toumi, who is an Algerian journalist specialized and expert in the Maghreb studies, who talks about the South African holding this summit.
So the 15th BRICS summit is full of symbolism. It's the first time a BRICS summit is taking place in Africa, where the African continent has been in the complex, has been considered as a complex number of the international politics and its geopolitics equation in light of the international politics tensions. There are 23 countries are willing to join the BRICS. A new parameter of world affairs is on the horizon, a shift of international system post the end of the Cold War in 1989 and post 9/11. Hence, a multi-alignment movement was born. Indeed, despite the heterogeneity of the main BRICS members, for instance, like India and China, but with new members in joining the BRICS in the near future, either will get full membership or observatory members, will beef up the BRICS to be strong southern pole, but it needs a strategic global project and not just a non-alignment voice allied 77 group in the UN General Assembly. As far as MENA members desire to join the BRICS go.
Mr. Dennis, what Africa represents at this particular time holding this summit, that is something big at this particular time within the geopolitical changes happening in the world?
There has been an interesting process that has happened as a result of this conference. It was an interview with some of my colleagues did with a man by the name of Dr. Paolo Raffoni, and he is a founder and general manager of the Italian Center for International Perspectives. So he's been an observer for Africa for about 40 years, and he made a couple of interesting points about what he thought this conference meant. He said that the trend with respect to China and India and other countries involved in Africa, he said the decline of Western influence in Africa began in the 1990s. It worsened with the war on terror in 2001. And then once you had the killing of Gaddafi in 2011, it sort of just went into reverse gear. Now, I don't want to go into a lot of politics right now, but I want to say one thing about the issue of the West in Africa versus what has been being done by Russia, China, India, and others, and what this conference indicates. The terrible legacy of regime change, of responsibility to protect the Tony Blair doctrine that he talked about in 1999, the notion of conditionalities, of somehow introducing these various project democracy sort of innovations has clearly failed all over the world. And somehow, whenever you have a country that goes into that arrangement with the United States or with NATO or others, they come out, their countries are devastated, whether you're talking about Iraq or Afghanistan or any other areas where these so-called interventions happen. And so they're like failed military revolutions in which there's a lose-lose instead of idea of win-win. I think what has happened in Africa, particularly because of what's happened recently in Niger, which is an interesting case. There's of course, there was a coup, or what people are calling a coup, but at the same time, there's a great support for the idea of getting rid of the French dominance. Because remember, there are 14 countries just in that Sahel area whose currencies are all pegged to this CFA, this franc, that's made for the African countries. So they don't have their own independent currencies. The value, they have independent currencies, but the value is determined in France. And so what has happened is that this process is now being opened up. This is being moved away from. And I think what's important here is when you're looking particularly at Black Africa, I mean, let's also just take what happened with Muammar Gaddafi also made the point continually about development. The underground rivers in Libya, the living standard of people in Libya, the use of oil and so on for the purposes of economic development, whatever. And I'm not talking about whether you agree with Gaddafi. I don't mean that, because that's the whole issue, is that there are different policies which many of us will disagree with from country to country. People have to govern themselves. We should not have a situation of universal dictates of government. And I believe that that is what has come from NATO. I believe that's what's come from the United States, Great Britain in particular, and the colonial powers. Instead of that, just take one example, an excellent example just happened, where Xi Jinping, China just translated a book called Up and Out of Poverty into Hausa, into the language spoken by Nigerians and people in Niger. Now, there's a great big border dispute going on there. Many of us know about it. We won't go into it here. But by taking the ideas of how to get out of poverty and creating a situation where you have an economic engagement, but now you also have a cultural engagement where people can begin to discuss this question independent of ideology. That's a great initiative. And that's a situation where people who are facing real problems, and they may be very different, but they are very concrete, know that you care, know that you're trying to address them, know that you're trying to resolve them. And I believe that this issue of the new development bank shows, as was already just said by the representative from Beijing, this allows for all sorts of people to be inspired that, in fact, they can rise up on their own initiative, in their own effort, in their own voice, and not have to do that in the shadow or in the wake of somebody else. I think that's a really important thing. It's a kind of declaration of independence in the actual spirit of the original American Declaration. And so I think Americans should be very happy about what's going on.
Very, very interesting points you have raised, which is quite realistic. Mrs. Zhang, I believe you do agree with what Mr. Dennis has just stated, and he was kind of focusing on the African continent. But now, coming to you, will the recent global economic circumstances, including the impact of COVID-19 and events such as Ukraine conflict and US sanctions on Russia, accelerate the Brics fulfillment of its objectives?
It's very interesting. And before answering to your question, I would like to add in another example to what Mr. Dennis just said, also in cooperation in anti-poverty efforts that China did, and also trying to make contributions in the future. The counterexample is in Zimbabwe, which asked to participate this time in the New Development Bank, which is under the Brics mechanism. So in 2001, the U.S. enacted the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which effectively prevented Zimbabwe from entering the international credit market. So American companies have stopped doing businesses with Zimbabwe for fear of sanctions, which in turn affects Zimbabwe's economic and trade exchanges with other countries. And also, this ultimately dealt a very devastating blow to the economy of Zimbabwe. So who actually receive these problems? Who actually receive this influence? Is the people of the Zimbabwe who take the hit. So these sanctions have made it impossible for Zimbabwe to obtain international loan financing, and U.S. sanctions have been a weapon of destruction that prevented the Zimbabwe government from obtaining funds to repair roads, to repair hospitals, to build infrastructures, and especially since millions of ordinary people in Zimbabwe lack access even today to clean water, to cheap housing, to infrastructure, to affordable healthcare. So that's why also for Zimbabwe application to join the New Development Bank, hoping to have a new pathway to find a new solution with developing countries, if this would be a game changer for the fate of the country. So it is important to say that even here I quote what the president of New Development Bank and former president of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff, has said, that the bank actually represents the ability of emerging market and also developing countries to bring about major changes in the world. And also we can say that today, according to the data, since its inception, a total of 98 projects in the member countries have been approved with a total investment about $23 billion US. So we can see that here is a massive investment which is going on now between the developing countries, and also the key areas cover different areas that you can imagine. For example, we can talking about the clean energy, we can talking about the transport infrastructure, we can talk about the water and sanitation, we can also talk about the environmental protection and social infrastructure, and also digital solutions in this ever-changing world. And it is very important to mention the COVID that you just talked about. Is there any possible solutions that this Brics mechanism, that this new development bank can offer to the developing countries? The answer is yes, because after the COVID, the new development bank quickly responded to the urgent needs of its member countries and set up an anti-epidemic emergency assistance loan facility of a total of $10 billion US, of which $5 billion are used to support member countries' most urgent healthcare needs, and also the $5 billion remaining are actually used to finance the expenditures related to social security, to support the economic recovery of its member countries. So it is very important to see that the developing countries are using their sum of money in the places that's the most needed for the developing countries' development. And also today you've just talked about the Ukraine conflicts going on. So we can see that there's many uncertainties coming with what's happening now between, for example, the U.S. and the developing countries, between the U.S. and the South countries, underdeveloping countries. So we can see that there's many uncertainties coming, but there's one thing that is certain, is that today the developing countries' voice are heard. The developing countries are trying to find their common benefits, their common issues, to address some common issues together in front of developed countries in the world. So this is interesting to see this trend to form a new voice for developing countries and by the developing countries.
Very interesting. Mr. Dennis, the increasing Western interest in BRICS and the significant media coverage of this summit raises multiple questions. How do you read this special interest? Does BRICS genuinely trigger Western concerns?
No. In fact, what happened here is very interesting. It's very funny in one sense, if you have a certain kind of sense of humor, because back in 2013, I remember distinctly in September when Xi Jinping first began to discuss the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative, he approached then President Barack Obama about it. And he was talking about this idea of win-win cooperation. And it was basically just completely ignored. It was as though he hadn't said it. And what happened was that there was a process that happened that was, of course, there are other things that preceded it. There'd been the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. There'd been other things that had been done. We of the Schiller Institute have been involved in this from the ground floor for other reasons, going back to the early 1990s at the time that the Berlin Wall fell and everything was changing in the whole world. And we are then, the late Lyndon LaRouche formulated a plan which was coherent with, congruent with, what people were talking about beginning to discuss in China at the time. We were doing it independently. But all of us converged sort of in the 90s around this concept that you had to have this concept of economic development. But you couldn't get any interest from the people in the State Department. You got some interest from people in the Pentagon. That was the wrong kind of interest. And so people have been ignoring this. But now that it has suddenly become serious, especially after, I would argue, the draft memorandum of agreement between Russia and China of February 4th, 2022, and then the unfortunate developments that occurred, of course, around the war, and then the sanctions regimes that happened, where, the United States and London, the city of London, the two big financial centers, in other words, say, well, we're going to lead a financial nuclear war against Russia. Well, wait a minute. You basically seize over $300 billion from Russia. Other people begin to look around and say, wait a minute, isn't that actually expropriation? I mean, isn't that actually the opposite of what you say capitalism is? Isn't that actually sort of like, just theft? That might have implications. So what happened, of course, is that people began to see, wait a minute, this is really not something we want to have happen to us. What can we do, which is not in any way against the United States, but has to be for us? I mean, we have to have ways of ensuring consistency in trade, consistency in capital controls, consistency in economic controls, but most importantly, consistency in productive investment in roads, bridges, highways, tunnels, dams, basic infrastructure, advanced energy systems. The fact that Russia, for example, and also China differently, are discussing with various African countries nuclear power, which, for example, nobody brings up as part of the clean energy mix if you're talking to London or or New York. This is the issue. And so you can choose another path. And in fact, well, here's the irony. The United States and others would gain if they did this, gain both economically, that is, their populations would gain. Now, financial speculators would lose. And of course, that tends to be has been the story throughout history. And we'll have to see on what side these forces decide to place themselves.
Very good indeed. You put it, as you say, in a sense of humor. Assuming the current summit leads to accepting new members, how could this benefit the group as a whole and vice versa? What are the advantages that accepted countries could benefit from, Mrs. Zhang?
This is very interesting. The question that you raised up is that what kind of benefits can, if a country join the Brics mechanism, that will be quite new actually this time. And that's why I think why different, African medias or Chinese media today, we can see that each media actually are focusing on what's going on there, because that will be one of the first steps of this expansion of the Brics issue and of the Brics mechanism. So what are the criteria? For now, we don't, from my part, we don't actually received a very official criteria. So what we can see today is that, firstly, to enter this mechanism, you need absolutely to be accepted by all the 5 members of the mechanism. This is the first important thing. And also I would say it is also very important that you are a developing country. So in these cases, we can see that there's many possibilities to come, and especially when we see those countries, like more than 20 countries, have already expressed their sweat, their wishes to coming to be part of the BRICS mechanism. So that would be interesting actually to see what's going on and what will be going on, which countries are likely to be joining the BRICS mechanism. And it is also important to notice that when it joins the BRICS mechanism, and also when participating in the BRICS summit, including the issue of creating a new global currency, including the issue of more cooperations to come in energy cooperation, in South cooperation, in infrastructure cooperation, in financial cooperation, in security cooperation. So why is it unlikely that such a currency is going to emerge in the course of this year? So I don't think that now, when we talk about the currency cooperation, I don't think that dollar will be replaced. I would say that there will be a new kind of ways of settlement of investment coming. And so it's likely to see that this time among the BRICS leaders, there will be also a time to set the stage for a gradual progression, the use of the national currencies, and also there will be more progressions to come in more energy cooperations, in more poverty reducing efforts to be done these years. So it is actually interesting to see that there's two modes of philosophy, of development of philosophy coming between just what I just mentioned, between the South cooperation and the North-South cooperation.
Very good indeed.
When we talk about the South cooperation, what is the most important thing now is about the poverty reduction. It's about cooperations between the developing countries.
I'm sorry to cut your train of thought, Mrs. Zhang Shui. We have reached the limited time of our special coverage. So thank you ever so much, Mr. Dennis. You joined us live from New Jersey, USA. Mrs. also Chang Shui, journalist from the CGTN from China. Thank you ever so much for taking part with us in this special coverage. To our dear viewers, thank you ever so much also for being with us in this late hour. For more updates, you can follow our social media platform, and also for tomorrow we'll be covering the BRICS summit for tomorrow as well as after tomorrow. And all I can say at the end, take care of yourself and good night.
This program was brought to you by Jizzy.
برعاية كوندور.
Condor, prenez votre envol.